everyone who's currently online. Welcome to day 2 of Access Week and our James Dickson Carr lecture. Access Week is a vibrant campus initiative dedicated to fostering an equity mindset that empowers all students to succeed. This year's themes, Unlocking Pathways to Success with a strong emphasis on the culture of care, emphasizes our commitment to the holistically supporting students. Throughout this week, we shine a spotlight on academic, social, and cultural resources that are crucial for the success of first-generation, low-income, and other historically underserved student groups. Access Weeks offer an engaging lineup of thought-provoking public lectures, hands-on workshops for faculty, staff, and students, as well as dynamic student programming, all designed to inspire, educate, and build inclusive campus community. So welcome. As a reminder, this is our recording disclaimer. By attending this event, you are giving us permission to record your image as well as all rights of the video. If you have any concerns, we have DICE staff around our room as well as located at our registration table, and those who are online, please feel comfortable to write in our chat. We would love to acknowledge the land on which we stand and as the ancestral territory of the Lenape people. We pay respect to the indigenous people throughout the Lenape diaspora, past, present, and future, and honor those who have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. We acknowledge that Rutgers University, like New Jersey and the United States as a nation, was founded upon the exclusions and the erasures of the indigenous people. My favorite part, our community acknowledgement. Thank you for being in our space. We want to pause to acknowledge the space we hold as a community within ourselves as well as another as we navigate this current institutional, local, and global events, social issues, ongoing tensions and contradictions, the heightened antagonism toward action for equity, inclusion, diversity, and access, the impact and presence of illness, daily distractions, pressing deadlines, competing priorities, personal and personal and collective griefs, and those beyond this space, spoken and unspoken, which may be impacting us in so many different ways. So personally, again, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to be in community with us today, in person as well as online. Now, we went over our welcome. We're going to do some housekeeping, but I want to give everybody a reminder of why we're here, who James Dickson Carr is, his legacy, and then we're going to hear from one of our student speakers who will introduce our amazing keynote speaker for this afternoon. Housekeeping. We have bathrooms located both in the front and the back. In terms of men and women, gender-neutral bathrooms are located on our 4th floor. We'll have 2 mic runners located on our sides to open it up for any questions that anyone may have, as well as a staff member who's focusing on our chat. There is a prayer and meditation and lactation space on our 2nd level. Now, who is James Dickson Carr? James Dickson Carr was the first African-American to graduate from Rutgers University, Rutgers College, with a bachelor's degree in 1892. He was a talented scholar who was part of Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society and had the esteemed privilege of delivering the commencement speech during graduation. He was inducted into Rutgers Hall of Distinguished Alumni in 1991. And in 2017, Rutgers had renamed 2 of their libraries after James Dickson Carr, one being here in New Brunswick, on our Livingston campus. Rutgers also offers a merit scholarship called the James Dickson Carr Scholarship for undergraduate students. Something else that's not noted here, but I do want to share, is a part of Rutgers Scarlet and Black series and their digital campaign. In 1919, James Dickson Carr wrote a letter to the then president of the university, President Demarest, to talk about Paul Robeson, who's one of our most notable alum, the third African American to graduate, to protest or to talk about his disdain for us as Rutgers not supporting our student who was multi-talented, highly educated, and we should support him because not only was he the best, but he has so much to offer. So in honor of James Dickson Carr, we offer a lecture series in his honor to support not only our students, but our faculty and staff on better ways to support our Rutgers community as a whole. So now what I would like to do is introduce our student speaker, who is currently a junior here at Rutgers University and a part of our cohort programs as a Posse Scholar, Ms. Larissa DePaula, to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much. It is an honor to introduce Dr. Wilson Okello. Dr. Wilson Okello is a transdisciplinary artist and scholar who draws on Black critical theories to advance research on knowledge production and human development. Most immediately, he is concerned with how Black critical approaches make visible the epidemic foundations that structure what it means to be human and imagining otherwise possibilities for Black being therein. He is also concerned with how theories of Blackness might reconfigure understanding of racialized stress and trauma, qualitative inquiry, critical masculinities, and curriculum and pedagogy to create conditions of possibility in education, context, and society. Currently, Dr. Okello is an Associate Professor of Education and Research Associate for the Center of Studies of Higher Education at Penn State. Please welcome Dr. Wilson Okello to the stage.
Lift up your faces. You have a piercing need for this bright morning dawning for you. History, despite its wretched pain, cannot be unlived, and if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Lift up your eyes upon the day breaking before you, give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it into the palms of your hands, mold it into the shape of your most private dream, sculpt it into the image of your most public self. Lift up your hearts. Each new hour holds new chances for new beginnings. Do not be wedded forever to fear or yoked eternally to brutishness. The horizon leans forward, offering us space to place new steps of change here on the pulse of this new day. May you have the courage to look up and out and upon the rock, the river, the tree, your country, here on the pulse of this fine day. May you have the grace to look into your sister's eyes, to look upon your brother's face and say simply, very simply with hope, good morning. To you all, let's say good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right, y'all, so I'm from the call and response tradition, so I need people to talk back to me. What a privilege, what an honor it is to be before you today. Thank you so much, Larissa, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to Dr. Tiffany Butler, to Kasia Wiley. Thank you to Tabitha Pierre, all those responsible for this moment, this invitation. It is truly, truly a gift to be before you. Thank you for those who joined in person. I hear it's a busy day on campus, so thank you for those who are also joining via joining us virtually. If you hear some raspiness in my voice, I have a toddler, and the toddler is learning to share. The toddler hasn't quite figured out the things that I want him to share and the things that I don't. And so what you might hear as a bit of a cough is just that. But I assure you that you are not in danger, and I'm okay. So I'm, again, excited to join you all on today. Many of you no doubt know that Black History Month in and of itself is a long idea. First established on February 7th, 1926, developed by the great Dr. Carter G. Woodson. In thinking about Black History Month, Dr. Woodson was concerned with two primary ideas, tradition and reform. Specifically, he was concerned with the celebration of Black traditions, culture, and ideals, and reform as a way to think about rigorous study. Woodson was calling on us to think about what I might call Black study, or the deep concentration on Black ideas and exploring their potentialities in the world, in policy. What might we do with these ideas? Woodson established the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915, and as a part of that association, they set an annual theme, they developed posters and dates for those who might be interested. Progressive high schools started developing Negro history clubs to further advance the idea and to talk more about the importance of Black history. By 1931, more than 80% of Black high schools were celebrating Negro History Week. By 1937, Carter G. Woodson, at the urging of the great Mary McLeod Bethune, developed the Negro History Bulletin, and this became another way for them to advance ideas as it relates to Black History Month. In 1976, as many of you know, we celebrated the first Black History Month, and so here we are, generally, in the 99th iteration of the idea of Black History Month, and what a brilliant idea it is. And so it is in that respect that I pay homage to James Dickson Carr, the many other forebears who have integrated colleges and universities, schools, organizations, those like Carter G. Woodson, those like Mary McLeod Bethune. And so I do want to take just a moment to acknowledge the trailblazing work of those individuals who have made it possible for individuals like me to stand before you. And so we could just take a moment. If I could borrow your time for just a short period this afternoon, I would begin by taking you to East Africa in 1983, and there we would find a woman named Leslie Scott. Scott would launch a game at the London Toy Fair that year that would go on to be one of the best-selling games in the toy industry's history. In 2017, it was reported that this game has sold more than 80 million units worldwide and still sustains popularity amongst children and adults. Even if you don't actively play the game, I'm almost certain that you have heard of it. Scott conceptualized the game with her family in the 1970s with children's wooden blocks. The game thus derives from the Swahili term, which means to build. The game is played with 54 wooden blocks. Each block is 3 times as long as it is wide and 1/5 as thick as it is long. The game, of course, is called... Okay, yes. Some of you have played Jenga before. Yes, from the Swahili term kujenga, which means to build. My family and I, we're intimately familiar with this game. My father is from East Africa, and so we played the game all the time. My mother, my father, my brother, my sister, and I, we would gather around our living room table, and we would carefully construct this 18-story tower, 3 blocks at a time. As many of you know, the game is played by first taking a block from anywhere beneath the top layer and placing it on top. The game continues until the tower falls or any portion thereof collapses. Right? By and large, we agreed with the rules as follows. At least my brother, my sister, my mother, and I agreed with the rules as follows, but my father seemed to have a different interpretation of the rules. My brother, my sister, my mother, and I, we would take great care to ensure that the blocks that we pulled from this particular tower didn't compromise the entire structure, right? So if there were 2 blocks in a layer, we pull from the middle one, right? Of course, we pull from the middle one to ensure that it still has 2 sturdy ends. My father, again, had this different understanding of the rules. My father would look for what those in masonry call the cornerstone, or the block that's set first. The cornerstone is important because it's set in relation to all the other blocks. As my father understood it, the cornerstone was significant because it could tell you about the integrity of a structure. If the cornerstone was off or set incorrectly in any way, then the tower was already collapsing. My father would oftentimes pull at this cornerstone, and he was oftentimes successful at both pulling it and placing it on top. But as you can imagine, the rest of us were not so fortunate. So the next person who would engage this tower was almost certainly responsible for collapsing it. In this way, my father was oftentimes declared the winner. as this would happen, my father would just look at the pile of rubble after we collapsed it, and he would simply laugh, and he would watch us rebuild. Notice I said he would watch us rebuild, and he never actually helped us rebuild. I still feel some kind of way about that. But I'm much clearer about what I believe was happening. See, my father understood something we didn't. My father understood that if your structure is fundamentally flawed, then no matter how smooth your edges, no matter how clean the structure looks, if and when it is provoked, it is going to collapse. My father remembered that all of the blocks in something like Jenga had small random variations in the dimensions, which meant that the structure that we took so much pride in constructing was already preparing to fall, was already going to fall. There was nothing that was going to keep that structure from standing. As I think about it now, I believe our wellness practices are very much like this structure of Jenga. Our wellness practices are fundamentally flawed, which is to say we place so much priority in continuing to do things, participating in practices and priorities that work for some but don't work for most. Like my father, those who are trying to sort of make us aware of the fundamental flaw of these particular practices, too many of us, myself included in many instances, are only interested in continuing to build with this shaky foundation, no matter how many times we have been told otherwise, no matter how many times we have seen that it is not working. It's in this way that Audre Lorde's much-used adage comes to mind when she talks about the master's tools not being able to destruct or to break down the master's house. Too often we're only interested in using the same tools to try to build up a sturdy foundation. And so, friends, I want to submit to you on this afternoon that we need a different set of tools if we are going to build a different type of foundation, if we're going to build a wellness practice, if we're going to build a type of wellness culture around us, we're going to need to work with different sets of tools in order to do that. And so I want to spend some time today working through a few ideas that I believe can help us to construct a wellness practice, construct a wellness culture that might be beneficial not just to us, but perhaps to those around us. In order for us to do that, I think we need to engage with a deep sense of pause. Certainly, if we've as I know many of you have been paying attention to the world around us in this particular moment, but certainly not even just in this moment. If we can look across the past 10 years, past 20 years, there's so much competing for our attention. There's so much competing for our peace. There's so much competing for our general wellness. And I'm wondering what it would look like for us to prioritize a deep sense of pause. I think about Toni Morrison's Beloved. In that particular novel, Toni Morrison, she writes in this character, Baby Schultz, who is a preacher of sorts, and she invites individuals to this notion of pause that I'm talking about. She engages with formerly enslaved folks in the clearing, is what it's oftentimes referred to as. She takes them to this clearing space, and it's in that particular clearing space that she begins to remind individuals of who they are, who they were long before they were enslaved, who they are and what they are, was a prescient reminder for her in this particular space. She talks about that here in this particular place, we flesh that weeps and laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. But what she talks about next, she talks about the ways that we have to love our flesh, because yonder, they don't do it. So beyond this space, when we go back into society, when we go back into the world, when we get beyond this perhaps central space, that we've got to figure out how to love ourselves. We've got to figure out how to engage ourselves in a culture of care that we know this world is not going to provide for us. I love the deep space of pause that she invites us to think about, because it's calling on us to think about how we rely on our inward tools right? Our capacity to love ourselves and others, to be in community with one another, to affirm that I see you, that I lift you up, right? How do we rely on the set of tools that might exist within us and within our communities instead of looking to the external world, instead of looking to society to do and be the thing that we need it to be? So can we engage with a deep sense of pause that allows us to look away from the external and begin to think about what we possess internally? Why is this important? Why? Because unwellness can affect multiple dimensions of our being. Right? We might understand the ways that unwellness affects us mentally. Right? We can think about the ways that it can serve as distraction and can flood our minds with anxiety and forms of stress, can take us away from prioritizing the things that we want to be thinking about, perhaps our students, perhaps our organizations, perhaps those in our community. We might understand the ways that it places a particular burden on us mentally, psychologically. It also has physical effects. There's ways that hypertension can set in for individuals when they're experiencing particular types of unwellness. There are ways that stress can begin to weather on the body, as scholars talk about this weathering effect, particularly for racially minoritized folks. There's a weathering that can happen that literally erodes at our sense of wellness. Right? So there are mental effects, there are psychological effects, there are physical effects. It affects how we think about our work, how we engage with our work, how we engage with others in our workspace. Right? It affects our relationships, both our intimate relationships and our social relationships. Unwellness, as I was talking with a student the other day who was talking to me about his particular bouts with unwellness and how it can take him to a particular space where nothing becomes important. People don't become important. It's hard to sort of set our thoughts on what we perhaps came to school to do when we are unwell. It affects turnover and retention. As many of you know, over the past, say, 5 or so years, student affairs in particular has been grappling with burnout and exhaustion. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but certainly it leads to turnover and attrition in our workspaces and the constant sort of cycle of having to look for individuals who might then come back, or not come back, but that we might want to hire into a particular workspace. Individuals aren't interested in moving into toxic environments. And so how are we ensuring that wellness is something that we're not only personally taking up, but creating a culture of care that can be supportive of individuals? There's certainly an impact on learning, and again, our personal life and our well-being is largely affected when we are unwell, when we have a culture of unwellness. Certainly has organizational effects as well. So when we think about workload and when individuals are experiencing unwellness, it can affect how we work. It can affect our desire, our very desire to work. Right? Notions of control begin to set in. When we don't feel like we have control over our daily life, over our daily schedules, unwellness can begin to set in. When individuals begin to sort of feel a sense of powerlessness in their work environments, this can have an effect on our wellness. When the reward structures are out of balance, right, and we don't feel like we have a good sense of the reward systems that we're located in, this can affect our unwellness. When we feel a discrepancy in fairness and particularly our values, when there's values misalignment in our organizational culture, this can lead to unwellness. And certainly, again, in our community, when we've experienced a culture of folks being unwell, there can be a ripple effect that can really move throughout the entire community. And so organizationally, it can happen individually, it can happen, but unwellness has a way of really sort of taking seed in a culture and and being felt throughout it. In this way, I want us to sort of think about wellness as an equity issue, right? How we think about our resources and connecting those to wellness becomes an equity issue. How we think about our own personal lives, right? And the cultures that we are part of, the communities that we are part of, this becomes, I believe, an equity issue. I really appreciate Audre Lorde's thinking as it relates to the ways that we might begin to think about care and wellness, particularly a sense of holistic wellness in the workspaces that we find ourselves in the organizational cultures that we find ourselves in. Particularly this last particular part, thinking about this notion of self-preservation as not being indulgent, but as a radical act of political warfare, right? Which is to say that we're moving against these external pressures to do more and to be more, to stand in the gap and to be all things for all people. It's a way of prioritizing the self, and that always, for me, is a political act of warfare. So, again, paying homage to Audre Lorde and the many Black feminists that informed her and that I'm thinking with on this afternoon. In her 1980 compelling novel, The Salt Eaters, Toni Cade Bambara, she writes about a Black feminist named Velma Henry. Velma Henry is a longtime political activist in her particular region. She's a veteran of the Black Power movement and the women's movement in this particular region. She's that person in the community, again, that I was talking about, that shows up for everybody, oftentimes at the expense of her own well-being. Velma Henry has found herself in the community clinic in this particular novel. She's in the community clinic because she's overextended. She's on the point, at the brink of exhaustion. To assist her in this season of her life, practitioners within this particular clinic, they call in a specialist. The specialist's name is Minnie Ransom. Now, as Minnie Ransom engages with Velma Henry, she asks her what I want to sort of grapple with this afternoon as one of the quintessential questions that I believe we need to sort of sit with if we're going to think about what it means to create a culture of wellness, if we're going to think about what it means to create our own sort of wellness practice. She engages her with this question of, are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? Just so you're sure, sweetheart, and ready to be healed, because wholeness, she says, wholeness is no trifling matter. Are you sure that you want to be well? It's a question that gives me pause. Are you sure that this thing is what you want? Yeah, when I hear that question, I feel some kind of way for Velma Henry, right? If I'm coming into a clinic, perhaps there ought to be this assumption that I'm interested in doing everything necessary to be well, right? I can imagine an incredulous Velma Henry saying something to the effect of course I want to be well, right? Why else would I have come? But what I appreciate about Minnie Ransom is that she doesn't take this for granted. She presses her on the issue as a way of pushing back past the habits that will oftentimes sort of exert when we come into spaces, which is to say that sometimes we can just get in the habit of thinking that we want a thing, that we want to be well, that we sort of want to pursue whatever it is that we're engaged in, without committing ourselves to the deep practice, without committing ourselves to the deep discipline of what, in this regard, would be wellness. Are you sure, sweetheart, she asks, that you want to be well? Just so you're sure, sweetheart, and ready to be healed, because wholeness is no trifling matter. Again, I appreciate the way she's calling on us to think about wholeness as requiring a different type of discipline, right? Wholeness, right, or holistic wellness, as we're talking about today, isn't something that's just going to roll in, right? It's not just something that we're going to be able to participate in every once in a while. It's not the sort of culture of care that we've become accustomed to in society that says that, if I light the candles or if I take the bubble bath, then my wellness practice is going to be all good. I've got everything I need. She's calling on us to think about a different type of discipline that's going to be required, right? And so, in this regard, I think that there's something for us to learn as it relates to what it means to create a culture of care. So, really quickly, as I sort of move toward these concepts and ideas I want to think with you about today, I find myself in moments like we are in right now, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I find myself not necessarily looking to the contemporary moment, but trying to think about what particularly Black people have thought about across the arc of time as it relates to what it means to exist in society, what it means to construct practices of wellness and regard. And so I find myself going to Black literature. And The Salt Eaters is one example of a Black feminist piece of literature that myself and a colleague began to interrogate to look for principles and anecdotes and lessons about how we might live in this moment differently. Right? And so The Salt Eaters, I think, is a really compelling novel, really compelling idea, presents several key compelling ideas that are situated in Black feminisms, which calls on us to always think about solidarity, calls on us to always think about wellness, calls on us always to think about what community looks like in and against structures that don't mean us well. I appreciate the ways it calls us to a politics of wholeness, which is to say, again, beyond just a simple care practice, but how do we think about what wholeness looks like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? There's an urgent need for care and compassion. I talked about Velma Henry, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but there are individuals who desire something beyond just sort of the ways we might think about healing or wellness, which is to say like a medicated practice. But there's something more that individuals desire, right? And how do we pay attention to that? How do we begin to sort of curate that? There's this introduction to a Black world, which is to say that I appreciate the ways that the writer situates healing in Black feminist knowledge production, Black feminist principles, right? It invites us to think not just about the presentation, again, of clinical work, but how might we situate this differently? There are diverse modalities of healing which call on us to think about our engagement with our spiritual selves, our psychological selves, right? There's an interconnectedness of wellness that is tied to individuals and community and being more in tune with our individual selves. I really appreciate the ways that Claiborne, the city where individuals are located, is contextualized in this particular book. It talks about Claiborne as an anti-Black environment, which is to say, how do we grapple with our wellness in environments, again, that do not mean us well, that are situated against our wellness, right? And how do we begin to navigate that collectively and individually? And so several themes begin to surface for me as I engage with Black feminist principles and ideas, and I'll talk about several of those ideas on this afternoon, specifically notions of care, notions of touch, or I'll refer to as intimacy, and notions of celebration. So care, touch, and celebration. As you work through this particular book and many other Black feminist books, you'll see a notion of care that is expressed, particularly in this novel, and I'll talk more broadly about notions of care, but particularly in this book, you see that there's a laboring with individuals before, during, and after they sort of, as they work through various processes, which is to say that it's more than just, take aspirin and then come see me in the morning, but how do we labor with individuals as they work through their various processes of care, of healing, right, and toward notions of regard. I really appreciate the ways that Black feminist texts allow us to think about notions of care as an ongoing praxis. There's notions of touch, or what I would really sort of think about as intimacy, that call on us to think about how we engage with one another. And this is beyond notions of touch that we might think about as sort of in the haptic sense, but really notions of proximity and coming alongside individuals. How do we eliminate spaces of distance so that we can be vulnerable with one another and share with one another in really proximate ways, which is to say, I can be known by you and you can be known entirely by me. How do we lessen the space between us such that we're creating intimacy between individuals? And then notions of celebration and really moving beyond notions of celebration that call on us to think about, heritage celebrations and, various types of recognitions, months, so on and so forth, which are very important, but I really appreciate the notion of celebration that gets us to think about this as a way of knowing, right? And so celebration becomes a way of how we lift up one another as we encounter each other, right? So it's, again, more than just the Black History Month, right? But how do we come alongside individuals in a full affirmation of individual, say, Blackness and the potentialities of Blackness beyond a month or a week or whatever sort of recognition we choose to give it. So really thinking about celebration as ongoing praxis, as a journey with individuals that sort of moves beyond how we thought about it in a Western sense, right, as a singular moment, as a space of affirmation, and we move on to the next one. So notions of care. Again, notions of care that really call on us to think beyond what the state might sort of categorize as care, right? So we might understand ways of thinking about care as, the state intervening and saying that we care about you in these particular ways, so here's a particular protocol, here's a particular sense of shelter that we're going to provide for individuals, here's a particular welfare program, or whatever that might be, right? But how do we come along in a deeper sense of care? How do we deepen how we understand care as the responsibility of accompaniment, right? This laboring with that I was talking about, that refuses boundaries between us, but really calls on us to think about how care can be a way of living and doing life very differently, right? How can we think about care as more expansive, more capacious than just something that we provide individuals, a service that we provide individuals, and something that, again, becomes a way of journeying with, right? How do we accompany individuals in their journey toward healing? Thinking about touch as intimacy, and again, this is really thinking about us in relation to one another. So again, eliminating boundaries between us and really beginning to think about how we can be proximate with one another as we journey through this particular moment. I'm thinking a lot about mutual aid in this current sort of social political moment and how we might come alongside individuals. So if individuals were experiencing precarity before January, that sort of sense of precarity has only been exacerbated for many individuals. And the sort of concentric circles have widened in terms of who is going to be experiencing precarity moving forward. And so how do we ensure that we're thinking not just about notions of service, how do we think about care as moving beyond what we might understand as those deserving of our care, and really begin to sort of think about what a collective sense of wellness is going to have to be if we're going to survive beyond this moment and into the next, right? So how do we think about what it means to come alongside one another in really intimate sorts of ways? Daycare germs. So again, thinking about mutual aid, thinking about how we come alongside one another in relational ways. And then celebration, again, as otherwise. So really, again, calling on the cultural and the ancient approaches to notions of celebration that invite us to think about celebration beyond just the moment, right? How do we acknowledge how do we move toward an affirming of who individuals are, cultures, heritage that exists beyond, again, a singular moment in time, and celebrate individuals as a practice, as a way of knowing. And so care, touch, or intimacy and celebration, I believe, presents us with a method for thinking about what wholeness can look like, how we might live life and do life differently in this moment and again into the next. I think I agree in many ways with Bambara in this particular sense that we have gotten, in many of our communities, have normalized unwellness to such a degree that we have forgotten in some ways what wellness or what it means to be well looks and feels like, right? I think we have normalized unwellness and senses of unwholeness that we have forgotten how to walk upright, how to see clearly, as Bambara might put it. And I'm trying to think about how we might not only be able to name the ways in which we are out of balance with our wellness, but begin to cultivate something different, right? It's this deep pause that I believe that will allow us to, one, just think about what our practices look like, what we've asked of ourselves, what we've normalized, perhaps as unproductive, and then we can begin to sort of think about how we curate the inward tools that might manifest differently in how we live our lives, personally and in community. So as we move toward a practice of wholeness and regard, I want us to, that embraces care, that embraces intimacy and touch, that embraces notions of celebration beyond the particular moment. I want us to think about what it means to honor our humanity and honor the humanity of others. Excuse me. By rejecting these paternalistic ways of care. So for example, in what ways are we, have we already defined what we think care ought to be? How might we move away from that? How might we call on ourselves to engage with community and allow them to determine what care looks like and move in that regard, which is to say that we don't have all of the answers to what care can look like. Thank you so much, I appreciate you. We don't have all the answers to what care looks like, and we have to depend on one another to be able to share those things, right? How do we come alongside individuals in their articulations of care? Gets at this notion of accompaniment that I was talking about earlier. And then in terms of our governance and the cultures that we're creating, both in our various organizations, in our divisions, how might we challenge power dynamics that have instituted notions of care and wellness? How might we re-articulate what those power dynamics look like toward notions of relationality, toward notions of hearing one another and allowing individuals to determine, again, what care looks like, what it feels like, what it ought to do in our particular environments. How might we advance this power redistribution in ways that allows individuals to feel like they have some sense of care or some sense of authority as it relates to a wellness practice that takes place within the cultures that we find ourselves in. So cultivating practices that nurture relationality, mutual aid, and healing, I think, can move us toward a notion of wholeness. I want to think about praxis as messy and imprecise and not something that we're going to figure out right away, right? So if we're going to move out of notions of paternalistic care and wellness that have largely defined our organizations, it's going to be messy, right? There's going to be some coughing and sputtering and uncertainty, but I think that can be healthy for an environment, right? Because I think it means that we're figuring out how to breathe differently. We're figuring out how to do our work in a different type of way. And so I want to invite us into the messy that a praxis of wholeness and care requires, instead of relying on the notions that we've inherited and or the ones that we've just become familiar with. And so we don't feel the need to always pivot. But what could it look like to embrace notions of praxis as it relates to defining and constructing notions of wholeness and regard? So again, privileging notions of that might honor one's humanity requires that we confront toxicity in our environments. So where we desire care, we first have to name the ways that we've been unattentive to notions of care, right? Is there toxicity? Are there things in our environment that are simply not working, right? Are those building blocks that we've come to rely on and that we just keep building on that we ought to just leave in the rubble, right, such that we can build something differently, right? So how might we confront notions of toxicity? How might we think differently about the allocation of resources? I think do our budgets, for example, reflect our care practice or our ethics of care, right? Do the resources and the time allocation that we provide on various tasks reflect notions of care and wellness, right? Or a wholeness practice? How might we embrace our resources differently such that we are honoring individuals' humanity? As we think about our governance, what can we divest from, right? And what also can we work toward investing in, right? I talked earlier about being able to invest in individuals' ideas and their understandings of care and wholeness. So how are we prioritizing individuals as they come to the table? What are we willing to divest from as it relates to our cultural practices? Oftentimes, when it comes to our health, it's not that they are unimportant. I'll just say that they become de-emphasized in, I think, the everyday, right? So we get swept up in the quotidian, the everyday particularly in our student affairs work, in our faculty work, and it becomes moving from task to task, right? And we can de-emphasize the importance of health, which, again, is, I think, can be grounded differently as it relates to our sort of care and wholeness. And so what might it mean to prioritize it differently, right? To emphasize this as the culture that we want students to come into, right? The culture that we want faculty to be able to come into. How might we prioritize this? How might we regard it differently, such that it becomes a way of our being, right? Just who Rutgers University is, right? This requires something of us, right? It requires our own sort of willingness to consider vulnerability and relationality, to be in community with one another's in ways that prioritize deep trust, that prioritize eliminating our own sort of constructed boundaries between one another, right? So there are things I think that we have to be willing to invest in if we want to see, I think, a larger sort of governance practice take hold or a cultural practice take hold. What are we willing to commit ourselves to in that regard? And so I will, I'm looking at the time, I will pause there and I will we'll open it up for questions. There's a few points that I'll end on, but I'll save those for after our sort of question and answer. But I appreciate your attention at this particular juncture, and I would love to just open it up for thoughts and queries, for pushback, or whatever it is that you're feeling in this particular moment. So thank you all so much for your time and attention.
So thank you so much for this beautiful talk. I think the idea of where we are right now and thinking about wellness and the ways in which we are receiving, these hits from the world feels like all the more important of a time to be able to take stock. And so my question right now is, how do you start that process, right? So as an individual, I think it's easier to look at yourself and say, okay, based on this data point, these health metrics, where are we and where do we go? But what does it look like to take stock as an individual within your space, but also thinking about it from an administrative standpoint, or when you think about an organization, what does it look like to take stock of care? And how do you, start to put one foot in front of the other?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. A really important question, Dr. Butler. I think the first thing I'm thinking about is just being really clear about this as a priority. And so I'll actually move to something I was going to talk about. But in terms of being clear about our priorities in a moment and setting our intentions, so to speak, I really appreciate this sort of code of ethics as defined by the National Association for Black Social Workers. And what it is, what I see is really this cultural embrace of who we are going to be, what our ethics are going to allow for as we think about this sort of question of what we do, how we move forward. And so I really appreciate that they talk about, I regard as my primary obligation the welfare of the Black individual, the Black family, Black community, and will engage in action for improving social conditions. I give precedence to this mission over my personal interests, right? That's, when you talk about giving precedence to a collective call over your own personal interests, I think that begins to get at some of the tension that you're talking about, because it's easy for us, I think, to lift up our own, our own sense of wellness and care. I can do this, right? I'm going to prioritize me. I'm going to prioritize my family. But when you start to talk about what it means to lean into embracing this for a culture, for an organization, to embrace this over my personal interests, it can get a little tight for some folks, right? It can get, that's the point where you begin to sort of see how committed folks are to, say, a larger sort of collective call, all right? And so I'm wondering in this moment and the next, right, what does it mean for us to lessen our own sort of personal interests in the favor of a collective call that is going to require us to give up some things, right? That's going to require us to take a step back on our personal interests in favor of a collective call, right? I don't think we lose anything with the collective call, but I think there's a step we need to take in order for us to move in and to trust that the organization, right, and trust that the culture, right, is going to, investing in that is going to be able to support us in a deeper way. Right? Does that get out your question? I hope so. But the larger point that I'm making, hopefully in conjunction with Dr. Butler's question, is trying to figure out how we move out of our sense of self and toward a sense of the collective that might be able to embrace the messy, that might be able to embrace the tension, that might be able to embrace what we desire for ourselves, but for the larger collective. Thank you.
I just want to echo the thank you. I really appreciate this. And now real talk. Okay, ready? Yep. Your talk helped me, so I'm going to be messy in the practice of it being messy, so I'll be a real world example of that, right? So I'm thinking about how holistic and wholeness are related but different. That was actually one of the first things as I was like trying to make sense of what would wholeness look like. Yeah. Here's the messy part, is that like, my brain thinks like, I need some models of this. I need to, because when I think, I need the goal so I can work towards the goal. Now you can tell me maybe there's different ways to think about that. That's just how my brain's operating. Yeah. And I don't know where to look for where this is done well. Yeah. And I would love any insights you have around that. Yeah. And then the other piece so that's the question. And then the other piece that this raises for me is the role of like creativity. So you didn't say it explicitly, but I saw it sort of embedded in the different so if you could speak more to if and where creativity lies in this framework, that'd be really helpful. Yeah. Thank you.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for that really important question. In terms of the steps toward or the where this is done well. So I purposefully, in some ways, didn't talk about this as a three-step plan, for example, to wellness, because I think that it unfairly sort of casts wellness or this notion of wholeness, I think you're really calling our attention to, as something that is a step-by-step procedure. I think it is messy, but where I've looked is, again, thinking about sort of community models that have preceded us. So if I think about the Black Panther Party, for example, and the model of a breakfast program for children, right? In that model, I see a notion of care for not just an individual family unit, but how we might pool our resources in support of a larger communal goal, right? Which is to see all the children in our community well, right, and fed. And I'm imagining that notion of wholeness as if we can take care of our children, perhaps that takes some of the mental strain off of us having to worry about feeding our family, and that we can prioritize maybe some larger political ideas, right? So I think about this as if we're thinking about working toward this, I'm thinking about how we meet individual needs, how we can pool our resources to be responsive to individual needs. And as we do that, how might we also be thinking about, once we're together, how we can begin to think about, say, resistance and our political agenda, if you will, or a social agenda that is going to move beyond the meeting of material needs. So I think it's the two-step for me is really sort of thinking about how do we address the need, right? And then how do we, once we're sort of together in that, how do we think about what this might mean for the larger whole, or like what we begin to prioritize as, here's what we need to be doing to move towards a culture of wellness, right? Who do we need to push? Who do we need to call? What senators do we need to be on the phone with? Right, these are the sorts of things I think that can begin to happen as we figure out how we address the immediate and sort of material needs. And so, does that get at your question? Okay. Yes. I also want to, yes, thank you. There's a two-part question, so I want to make sure I'm answering the creativity part as well. But also, I just believe I believe in what people have created as models for how we can live the world differently, right? And so when I talk about sort of that breakfast program and the various strategies that encompassed it, right? More than just sort of a breakfast program. For me, that is a marker of creativity, right? I see genius in strategizing in that. And so beyond the ways we might be trained to think about creativity as sort of an aesthetic sense, right? Or visual or material creative sense, or aesthetic sense. I'm imagining creativity of strategy, right? Creativity of will, creativity in our organizing practices, creativity in just how we move in the world differently, right? And I think it's that imagination that allows us to believe that we can live in this world differently, right? Like we can exist differently, but it's that radical imagination that's gonna have to step outside of what we currently have, right? And the political imagination as it currently exists doesn't allow for, or I should say we've seen the extent of that creativity, right? And so how might we think outside of that? And I think that can only happen in community. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I may have missed this, but I think that your example of the Black Social Work Association, their code of ethics, makes me think about what you were talking about as when we're thinking about models of leadership and we think about them as communal, that's usually like gendered.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how might this play out differently, or how does gender inform the way? Because it doesn't seem far-fetched to me that communal ways of thinking about the collective and not the individual in a predominantly women-led field would not be far-fetched. But how does that change, morph, or become complicated when we're thinking about how the collective is made up and how societal gender roles or gendered ways of thinking about things can inform or cause some complicatedness?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I agree with you. So part of what I'm attempting to gesture toward in naming and working through Toni Moore naming the clearing as a space earlier in the presentation, and working with the Salt Eaters as a Black feminist text, and attempting to think with Black feminist principles is to gesture toward an otherwise of our sort of current way of thinking about leadership models and communal models, right? There's a long history of gendered formations as casting dependent on, the messianic leadership model that embraces patriarchal forms of direction and gathering and determining who should be out front and those who ought not to be. And so what I'm attempting to sort of think about is how we might move differently with these principles, how we might be able to take up principles that I believe are rooted in a Black feminist aesthetic of notions of care, notions of intimacy, notions of celebration, as a groundwork, right, for imagining an otherwise communal model than what we currently have in place right now, right? And so this is me really just affirming what you're saying, saying that I agree with you, and I think we need, as we move forward, my hope is that it will be less sort of, it will call on the genius of ordinary folks, right, to think about what our contribution can be, which is to say a decentralized model of leadership that is less reliant on I think the historical patterns that you're calling on us, that you're thinking about, that you're naming, and more reliant on a sense of praxis that can be rooted in a I'll say, women of color, really, aesthetic. And so I agree with you, is really what I'm saying. And that I think in order for us to be able to move differently, I think we need individuals who are willing to sort of name these principles differently, right? Which is to say that as you move forward in your practice, how are you ensuring that you're grounding it in this? And that individuals not just see it, but they know it, right? And I understand, like, this is the grounding that I'm working from. And if you're interested, you should go and read, right? And kind of attune yourself to that particular grounding. I think as we expose individuals to the potentialities of that grounding, it can begin to take shape in a different type of way.
Thank you. Some more Barbara Smith and less hierarchical.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I thought that was amazing. This code of ethics is honestly beautiful. I look at it and I say, the precedence over my personal interest, but I'm not a Black person.
Sure.
But I am a person of color.
Yeah.
And I have 2 children that identify as white. That's just how they look. How do I get through that messiness that you were talking about, where I'm gonna put my own self-being to the side, and I'm gonna talk to students, and they're gonna not come at me, but they're gonna come to me with these situations, these discussions that I don't understand, because that's not how I grew up. And I want to respect them, but how do I get through that messiness and have them understand that I hear them, you know? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I should name that, you know, my scholarship, my praxis is largely informed by Black critical theories and Black feminist ideas, but also recognize that there are other critical modalities for thinking about notions of care and notions of wholeness, right? And I mention that to say that there are other entry points for thinking about a lot of the ideas that I named today. You know, I privilege, again, a particular set of ideas, but there are other entry points. With that said, I think the priority that I want to leave you with is that there are ways I think we can be in solidarity with individuals without sharing an identity with them, right? And I think as we work toward notions of, again, lessening the proximity, for example, that I was talking about, or lessening the boundaries between us and moving toward sort of intimate, shared relationality, I believe it allows for a deeper conversation, perhaps, to be had. It allows us to hear, perhaps, your offering differently than we might say an individual just sitting across the table from you, or as an advisor. Let's just, I'm not, forgive me, I don't know where you're situated, but if it's, say, an advisor meeting a student, right, perhaps there's a way that we work towards notions of relationality that lessen that power dynamic and allow messages to flow in a very different type of way. So the principles, the ideas of care and intimacy and celebration that I'm talking about, I think are ways that can just move us toward a notion of solidarity that is, it's not to suggest that identity doesn't matter, but it is saying that I think we can move closer to one another in ways that allow us to see each other differently, allow us to value each other differently, and really allow us to show up for each other in a different type of way. And so, and the practice becomes, how do we disrupt notions of care, right, that we've been taught and are trained to sort of think about, or this is what we can do, for example, for students. How do we disrupt that such that we can invite a different form of care that allows us to share along with them, that allows us to move toward accompaniment and some of the other ideas that I was getting at. So the principles, I say, are not predicated on identity so much as, I think, a deep commitment to staying in those particular practices and principles with the people that we're in relationship with. Does that get at? Yeah. Thank you for that important question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okello. I think that may be all our questions.
Okay. Very good. Thank you all so much. And thank you again to those who joined virtually. Happy to continue the conversation, happy to be in conversation with you all as we all sort of collectively journey. So thank you. Appreciate that.
So as a part of our long journey I'll just use this mic. As part of our long journey that began with setting up Access Week, and over the summer, as we were considering bringing Dr. Wilson Okello to campus, he charged us. And when I say he charged and challenged us as a division, as an institution, to support our students. And we got to put our money where our mouth is. So today, as a part of Dr. Okello's James Dickson Carr speech, we identified a student organization that will be a recipient of $1,000 of their choosing from Dr. Okello. So I would love if our First Generation Student Union e-board members who are present can come up to our stage and receive your check. Opportunity for a photo while we're at it. So Dr. Okello hereby will donate $1,000 to the First Generation Student Union group at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. in honor of Access Week 2025. More round of applause. He provided and shared a lot of jewels and gave us actually a little bit more power, if you ask, some great strategies and tips for us to utilize, and definitely got us thinking about what we're willing to give up. And his final words of Ashe, as well as his contact information on social media if we're interested in following. Now, this is only day 2, but there's so many ways for our community online as well as in person to stay connected with us. And we can do so through tons of programming. So we have tons of programming for the rest of the week. Later this evening, we'll have our Thrive Student Support Services Empowerment Hour here in this room. On Wednesday, tomorrow, we will have our Progress Showcase, the New Brunswick Progress Showcase at the Livingston Student Center. On Thursday, we'll be back here in the College Ave Student Center for our Equity Applied workshop series with Dr. Paige Garner. And then we'll be at the Zimmerly Museum later that evening for our research and alumni mixer. And Friday, we'll have our community engagement with our Collaborative Center for Research. We're always looking to identify extern internship opportunities for our students. So as faculty and staff, if you have any opportunities available for our students, always consider us. Always consider our students. They are amazing, and they're always looking to gain some new experiences from your offices. And that also leads to mentorship. If you have some extra time, if there is some extra opportunities, always consider our students too. And earlier today, literally right before I came here, there was a student who stopped by our office to talk about unmet need and a term bill balance. So I'm going to bring up donations. I'm donating to our DICE Educational Opportunity Fund Scholarship. Our pre-college programs have our Bernard Fine Memorial Scholarship. We do participate in our Rutgers Giving Days, which will be coming up mid-March the 13th and the 14th, and we're always looking for your support and assistance because no amount goes unnoticed to support our scholars. We had so much fun today, and we always want to make it better. So at your seats and across our screen is our evaluation. So please consider giving us some very important feedback and great testimonial moments. Just in case you forgot to RSVP for tomorrow or Thursday, they're still here. If I skip too fast, it's just right on the table in front of you. If you don't have a QR code, we'll make sure that you do complete our survey. Now, this officially does conclude our James Dickson Carr lecture. We still have amazing lunch. Dr. Okello is here for a few minutes longer, so if you did not get a chance to ask some questions or you want to have some further conversation, let's definitely fellowship together. Thank you so much.